Hi, I'm Dwayne Brown. Tonight on KPBS Evening Edition, San Diego Port's CEO is out after a vote by port commissioners. Finding real estate listings that sound too good to be true? We'll tell you about a new tool to help the public avoid online real estate fraud.
And I'm Peggy Pico. Also ahead, how are big and small research facilities surviving NIH budget cuts? And what must they do to stay viable? Plus, immigrant children from the poorest country in Central America are not coming to the U.S. Why not? And where are they going instead?
I'll take the gas away.
And we'll look at the controversy surrounding the discovery of anesthesia in a new La Jolla Playhouse production called Ether Dome. KPBS Evening Edition starts right now. Hi, good evening. Thanks for joining us. The Port of San Diego CEO is out tonight. In a 6-1 vote earlier today, the board voted in favor of a severance package for Wayne Darboe. He's been CEO with the port for about 4 years, but was accused of using his position to help his son get a job, a summer job specifically. Darboe will remain on paid administrative leave until the agreement is finalized. Of course, we often hear about how much money politicians earn, but now you can find out how much a school principal or even a teacher makes. KPBS education reporter Matt Bowler has been looking into who gathered this information. He joins us now from the newsroom. So what makes this government list different from others we've heard about, Matt?
Well, this one includes education. Transparent California sent out all kinds, thousands of Freedom of Information requests. They sent 1,000 to almost every single school district in California. And it's never before been listed. All of the employees from every school district, from principals to teachers to custodians, who they are, what they do, and how much they make.
Yeah, interestingly enough, the salaries of San Diego Unified aren't on the list.
Yeah, there was some confusion. According to Robert Fellner, he was the project manager for this whole endeavor. He says that the San Diego County Office of Education initially said that they were going to handle all of the requests for all of the school districts in San Diego County. However, when they handed over the data, SDUSD wasn't on it. However, SDUSD did say that they will be responding on Monday.
And are we expected to see that new information then?
Well, no. I just got off the phone with SDUSD, and they say they're going to respond. However, they're only legally required to respond that they got the request for the information, and this is the steps they're taking to either contest the request or go about gathering the information. So we won't see any information from SDUSD at least next week. Anything
on the list stand out in particular?
Well, it was interesting to see how some teachers at small districts and some teachers at large districts all on the high end, all made, relatively large salaries by comparison. You would think that small districts would have a much harder time paying these higher salaries. Julian Union Elementary has 192 employees, and they had teachers on there making $100,000 plus a year with benefits. Del Mar Union Elementary has 2,300 employees. It's a much larger, much more moneyed area, and one teacher was making over $111,000 a year, including benefits.
KPBS reporter Matt Bowler. Drivers may be breathing a sigh of relief today at the gas pump. Gas prices have dropped below $4 a gallon for the first time since mid-March. The average for a gallon of regular in the county is now $3.99. There's a new tool to fight the growing proliferation of real estate rental fraud in San Diego. It's designed to combat an increasing number of online scams.
We've all heard the stories.
Leslie Kilpatrick is with the San Diego Association of Realtors.
A vacant for-sale home is fraudulently advertised for rent online for an incredibly low price.
That's red flag number one, offering a home for rent at a below-market price using an online site like Craigslist. The potential victim calls the number and is instructed to drive by to see if they like it.
There's usually an excuse of some sort why the landlord can't show it today, such as being out of town, in the hospital, or transferred by the military.
So the victim wires the deposit money, and that's the last they hear from the scammer. County District Attorney Bonnie Dumanis.
These types of crimes are always very difficult to prosecute. In the majority of complaints our office gets, the swindler isn't in San Diego. They're oftentimes in a foreign country or overseas. This means that it's very difficult to catch them, to prosecute them, and to get your money back.
The San Diego Association of Realtors is giving out new stickers to be placed on windows of vacant homes, making it clear to potential buyers it's for sale and not for rent. The message here is don't wire or send money unless you can verify you're dealing with the person authorized to sell it. Wayne Bell, the California Real Estate Commissioner, says it's a widespread problem throughout the state.
California consumers need to be continually on guard and cautious against those criminals, almost all unlicensed, who are trolling for victims.
Earlier this year, the San Diego Association of Realtors warned of people stealing prescription drugs from medicine cabinets while touring homes. San Diego police are looking for a man and a woman suspected of carjacking a cab driver. This happened just before 6 last night at Fairmount and Orange Avenues in City Heights. After flagging the cabbie down, they pulled a gun and forced him out of the car. But they didn't get very far. Police found the cab about a mile away after they crashed it into another vehicle and fled on foot. Some anti-tax groups are criticizing California water districts for considering raising property taxes without a public vote. It's an effort to help pay for the Delta Tunnel project. It would transport water in tunnels from the Delta to Southern California. Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association is one group looking into the legality of the plan.
Well, the short answer is you cannot impose this property tax without a vote. But the issue is whether or not, when the voters approve the state water project back in the 60s, whether or not that will constitute the voter approval for this particular project. And I think that's still very much in question.
In other news, more than 57,000 Central American children have crossed the U.S.-Mexico border illegally since October. Peggy Pico takes a closer look at one group of kids that's surprisingly not part of the exodus.
San Diego Congressman Darrell Issa recently came back from a fact-finding trip to Central America and says poverty is the main reason immigrant children are making the dangerous trek to the U.S. But that's not the case in Nicaragua, Central America's poorest country and second poorest country in all of Latin America. U.S. Border Patrol agents have apprehended fewer than 200 Nicaraguan children this year, compared to more than 16,000 children apprehended from neighboring Honduras. KPBS reporter Jill Repligal joins me with more about the unexpected gap. And Jill, tell us more about these Central American countries. How are they different and what are their similarities?
Yeah, well, they all have a very similar history. El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Guatemala all had revolutionary wars in the middle to late part of the last century. In Honduras, didn't have a war, but it was also very sort of involved. It was roped into those other conflicts. Pitted leftist revolutionaries against the oligarchy and often military dictatorships. And today, all those countries have very similarly poor social indicators in terms of things like maternal health and poverty. They're all quite poor. And yet, Nicaraguan kids aren't fleeing to the U.S. border. And I spoke with a lot of experts about why this is, and there are many reasons. Right now, we're going to hear from Ev Mead. He's the director of the Transborder Institute here at the University of San Diego, and he's an expert in Central American migration.
If you look at even problems that are very specific to kids, like the dropout rate from school, rates of infectious disease, youth disengagement with civil society, Nicaragua, again, it's right there with Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. If you start looking for things that are different, though, take a look at the homicide rate. I mean, it's a gross metric. It's a big oversimplification of the different kinds of violence, but boy, it sticks out.
Right, so let's look at that homicide rate. Nicaragua's homicide rate is, Honduras' homicide rate is 8 times higher than Nicaragua's. 90 murders per 100,000 people. It's one of the most violent countries in the world. It has the most violent city in the world, San Pedro Sula, where many of these kids are coming from. And Guatemala and El Salvador also have high homicide rates, not quite as high as Honduras, but much higher than Nicaragua's. Why the disparity between the rates of violence in these countries? Well, experts I talked to really trace it back to those same revolutionary histories. Unlike in El Salvador and Guatemala, Nicaragua's revolution was very successful and had a lot of widespread support. So the Sandinistas, that's what they were called, overthrew the dictator back in the 1970s and had overwhelming support at that point. It's very popular. And they really cleaned out the police and the army. They got out, all the sort of bad apples and really started fresh with a kind of community policing, really responsive to the local population, sort of.
I also understand that the main gangs operating in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala actually started in the U.S., and then immigrants from those countries got involved in the gangs here. Tell us a little bit briefly about how those two play into each other.
Yeah, there's sort of two major transnational gangs that operate in Central America, both started in L.A., and when U.S. and with a lot of immigrants from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and when the U.S. stepped up deportation starting in the 1980s, they sent tons of young people back to those countries, and gangs really flourished there. The countries weren't ready to take these people back; they didn't have jobs for them. Policing was bad, and they flourished.
But Nicaraguan, again, different story.
Yeah, so Nicaraguan immigrants, for one thing, there weren't many of them in Los Angeles, not in the same kinds of numbers. Nicaraguan immigrants in the U.S. mostly settled in Miami and Northern California, so that's part of the story. And also, Nicaraguans were more likely to have legal status in the U.S. Because of their history. The U.S., they were considered, the Nicaraguan government was considered an enemy of the state, and so they got refugee status, whereas we supported the governments in Honduras and El Salvador, and so it wasn't in our interest to take them as refugees because that seemed to go against our policy. And Ev Mead says that led to very different outcomes for Nicaraguans.
It means that those Nicaraguans who were here had a much better chance of becoming legal permanent residents and then citizens, and thus they didn't suffer this sort of cycle of deportation and return that Guatemalans and Salvadorans did.
Right, and so Mead says that cycle of deportation and then trying to get back has created all sort of consequences for those countries.
They were much more likely to be deported and much more likely to get on this down cycle where you're spending a lot of money trying to get back into the United States, borrowing money, paying smugglers, but it also means that you have communities in both places where kids grow up without their parents. And thus they're more likely to get in a street gang, and thus they're more likely to be subject to all the kinds of coercion and violence that go with that. And they're more likely to be deported. They're more likely to be incarcerated. I mean, these things kind of cycle up from there.
So those were some good explanations, but if not in the U.S., then where are Nicaraguans immigrating to?
Costa Rica. Costa Rica is right south of Nicaragua. There are actually more Nicaraguan immigrants in Costa Rica than in the U.S.
All right, KPBS reporter Jill Replogle, thank you.
Thank you.
Civic San Diego has a new president tonight. Mayor Kevin Faulconer announced Reese Jarrett will head the development agency. The former vice president of the Southeastern Economic Development Corporation says he wants to focus on downtown and partner with neighborhoods to create jobs and retail space.
We also want to become a very important part of partnering with neighborhoods and bringing economic development, starting with jobs, creating lifestyles of retail and other amenities that people can look to have balanced communities. And that's going to be our mission.
The agency's new president, Reese Jarrett, the interim president, Jeff Graham, stepped down in February. Women are breaking new ground in the air, making history on the newly chosen Blue Angels team. 27-year-old Marine Captain Katie Higgins will be the first female pilot on the Blue Angels demonstration team, and 34-year-old Marine Corps Captain Corey Mays from MCAS Miramar will serve as the team's events coordinator. The Weather Service says there is an 80% chance of an El Nino this fall, but California still might not see any rain, only slightly warmer temperatures.
The impacts of El Nino for Northern California are kind of a net neutral as far as precipitation goes. Over the last 6 El Nino events that we've had here in Northern California, half of those we've seen very little change in our precipitation, but the other half we've have seen an increase in our total amount of precipitation.
Notice that meteorologists spoke of Northern California. Actually, the Weather Service says Southern Cal is the part of the state most likely to see significant rainfall. A new production at the La Jolla Playhouse shows what it was like to have surgery before anesthesia. And it wasn't pretty. KPBS culture reporter Angela Carone takes us inside the Ether Dome and the race to discover painless surgery.
You can't help but cringe during the opening scene of Ether Dome. It's 1846, and dentist Horace Wells is pulling out a woman's tooth. She has no anesthesia. Her arms and legs are strapped in. Finally, he yanks the tooth from the root.
Fight! 4 minutes and 28 seconds.
Michael Backinson is the actor playing Horace Wells. He says Wells was considered a good dentist because he was fast.
But he was sort of tortured by the fact that he inflicted so much pain in removing teeth. The adage of the age was that a surgeon or a dentist, they would bring along 2 bottles of whiskey, one for the patient and one for themselves afterwards.
There are 4 surgeries in Ether Dome. Director Michael Wilson.
Watching the audience last night was so exciting because you'll see one woman was doing this and one woman was doing this, and then there's other people that are doing this. They're just so fascinated.
The play is based on a true story.
The plot of the play is about who created the idea that by inhaling a gas, we could actually put people under and then perform this surgery painlessly.
Some patients need more gas than others.
Horace Wells realized inhaling laughing gas through a balloon would help patients feel less pain. He had a student named William Morton, who was actually an experienced con man.
I'll pay you back.
Morton took Wells' idea of inhaling laughing gas, substituted ether, and anesthesia was born.
When he's asleep, I'll take the gas away so you can get to his tumor.
Elizabeth Egloff wrote the play.
William Morton had never been to school, much less medical school. He had no scientific background whatsoever, but he had the nerve to risk the patient's life and just do it.
Without William's daring and perhaps reckless drive, ambitious drive to achieve his compound, it could have been in research and development, collecting data for years.
The discovery gave birth to modern medicine. Suddenly, hospitals needed more staff and beds. They had more patients.
One of the great speeches in the play, they talk about we used to do 1-2 surgeries a week. Now there's 20 a week. Everybody wants to have surgery because they can.
Morton took all the credit for the discovery and never acknowledged his teacher, Horace Wells. This destroyed the sensitive dentist.
So what you see is the transformation of somebody who's really an idealist, very sweet, expecting the best of the world, and then being terribly disappointed by the fact that his protege gives him no credit.
I never want to see you again. Get out!
Wells began experimenting with drugs, especially chloroform.
The chloroform was the equivalent of him deciding, I guess I'll try heroin on myself. And within a matter of less than a year, he was living in really squalid conditions in New York and got himself in major trouble.
Wells was arrested for throwing sulfuric acid on prostitutes on the streets of New York. Some say he became the inspiration for the short stories about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Meanwhile, his famous student William Morton realized he could patent and sell inhalation anesthesia. This didn't go over well with the doctors at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston.
Am I not a human being as much as you? I shall strike her down. I shall strike her down! Stop it, old man, stop it!
The title Ether Dome comes from the name of the old surgery center at Mass General, where William first demonstrated how anesthesia would work. To this day, Mass General gives William Morton the credit for discovering inhaling anesthesia. There is no mention of the dentist, Horace Wells. Angela Carone, KPBS News.
That story was produced by KPBS video journalist Katie Shulove. Ether Dome will be at the Jolla Playhouse through August 10th. 8 dogs graduated from the California Highway Patrol Academy today. The canines and their handlers spent 11 weeks training in criminal apprehension and drug detection. Officer Matt Fowle says he and his dog, Paquito, are ready to go to work right away.
We're looking for drugs coming from the south and going to the north, and also money going from the north back down to the south, also from east and west, whatever direction we're going to try to find, interdict these the criminals also that are traveling on the highways of the state of California.
I'm Mark Sauer. Reflections 1 year later on the demise of Mayor Bob Filner and his progressive agenda. Escondido ignores pleas to shelter immigrant children, and the Padres stall while the Chargers rev up for an important season. Join us for these stories and more tonight at 8:30 on The Roundtable.
Financial concerns at Scripps Research Institute led them to explore options of merging with USC. That deal fell through. But in light of federal budget cuts, Peggy Pico takes a look at financial options for research groups.
Scripps Research Institute projected a $21 million budget deficit for the fiscal year. But merger talks with the University of Southern California recently ended, and the president of Scripps Research Institute announced he would resign. Here to discuss what other viable options for financially stretched research facilities are is my guest, Steve Corral, Dean of UC Davis Graduate School of Management. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Peggy.
Now, when it comes to Scripps, it's a nonprofit research institute. The merge might have actually helped them with their funding base. How might mergers like this, though, benefit a university the size of, let's say, or the reputation of USC?
Well, Scripps has great strengths in biomedicine, and in some of these areas are areas where University of Southern California is not as strong. So it was really a complementary fit from an intellectual and academic standpoint.
And what are some of the reasons that then a merger like this would fall through?
Well, there's a million reasons. There's often challenges with respect to the organizational culture. So Scripps Research Institute and USC are really quite different organizations. Many would say, well, they're both academically oriented, and that's true, but they're quite different. USC is a very broad, comprehensive university with lots of different types of academic units, whereas Scripps is focused on biomedical research. And so oftentimes there are challenges with respect to the fit of a scientifically oriented institution like Scripps and a broader campus like USC. So oftentimes there are challenges with respect to the organizational culture. There may be also challenges with respect to integrating the leadership. So you've got a president of USC, you've got a president of Scripps. So there can only really be one president of the merged institution. So there are often challenges associated with who's going to really be the
That would be the challenges in any merger, actually, regardless.
Exactly.
Give us a snapshot of how researchers these days are surviving the NIH funding cuts.
Right. It is a big challenge because the NIH has reduced its funding due to reductions from government support. And so institutions like Scripps are looking to diversify their portfolio. So they're seeking greater support from philanthropic sources of funds, so gifts from wealthy individuals or corporations, more contract research from, say, pharmaceutical companies in the case of Scripps. And so those are ways to diversify their portfolio outside of the federal government support from the National Institutes of Health.
What do you think some of the key changes research facilities need to do to stay viable, in addition to what you were saying, sort of to stay viable, I guess, and competitive, and what's really quite a growing industry?
Well, this is a challenging situation for the leadership because the leadership needs to look out into the future 1, 2, 3, 5 years out to see what trends are clear, and then to try to diversify the portfolio so as some sources of revenue go down, others, say federal government research is going down, but philanthropic revenue can come up. And so oftentimes the sources of revenue are counter-cyclical in the sense that one goes down and the other goes up. And so that's part of the management challenge for an institution like Scripps.
Well, I know there was at one point, and I believe it was Salk a few years back, was looking for private funding and private donation, just as in a nonprofit.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a great way to go, and it's very important. And the advantage of a lot of private money is that it can be put in endowment. So the principal is invested, and then the interest off of that principal then is used for operational purposes. And a lot of universities and research institutions benefit a lot from an endowment because it gives them stability and the ability to plan their revenue streams.
Shortly after the USC Scripps Research Institute merger fell through, Scripps Research Institute president, as we mentioned, announced his resignation. Right. Does that tell you anything, or is that something typical that happens with mergers?
Well, it's challenging. So managing any academic institution is challenging because they're very flat organizations. They often have very few levels of hierarchy. In a way, they're run more like partnerships, like a law firm or an accounting firm. And so a chief executive has to be very careful to ensure shared governance with the faculty and make sure that the faculty are coming along in any big strategic decisions that are being made.
All right, Dean of UC Davis Graduate School of Management, Steve Corral, thank you.
Thank you, Peggy.
I'm Gwen Eiffel. On the next News Hour, is there a link between mental illness and creative genius? That's Friday on the PBS News Hour.
Let's check out the weekend forecast now. Clouds to start the morning along the coast, giving way to sunshine. Temperatures mostly in the low 80s. A mix of sun and clouds for the inland valleys. Temperatures in the upper 80s. Clear and sunny in the mountains. Temperatures in the mid 80s, as we can see right through Monday. And a heat advisory for the desert ends at 9 tonight. Temperatures there well above 100 degrees. As you can see, 108, the average there right through Monday. You can find tonight's stories on our website, kpbs.org/evening edition. And we'll leave you with another look at some of the sights from the 45th Annual Comic-Con. It continues through the weekend in downtown San Diego. Thank you for joining us. Have a great weekend.